one of the things I noticed about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, there were two things that I noticed that I really didn't like. The first is that because I'm a personality psychologist as a researcher, not as a clinician, but as a researcher, I know the literature on gender differences in personality because it's part of my field. And I could tell that I was starting to have some reluctance to deliver the lecture on gender differences. Now, I didn't stop, but I felt that I was treading on thin ice by delivering those lectures. And I thought, oh, that's not good, because I'm like a comedian. I'm pretty much willing to say anything that I think is true, and regardless of the consequences in some sense, because I'd rather take the consequences of what's true. And I thought, this isn't good, because if someone like me, who's rather uncontrollably mouthy, let's say, is starting to have second thoughts about teaching what's a very serious topic and something about which there's a very well-developed science, then how much are other people starting to censor? And at the same time, my students, many of whom were female, were telling me that they were really hesitant to talk about gender differences in any of the courses they were running. And I thought, oh, this is not good. This is seriously not good. And it's certainly the case that my colleagues censor themselves increasingly on campus with regards to the topics they're willing to discuss. And it's subtle, because imagine in a given lecture, I could discuss any of 10 things, and 3 of them are taboo. Well, I just won't discuss those, and that's a kind of invisible censorship. It's not like I'll get up and say, look, I could have talked to you about gender differences in personality, but I won't because I'm afraid. I'll just pick another topic because there's lots of topics to choose from. And that means there's going to be a bunch of topics that are really important, because actually the issue of sex differences in personality happens to be really important, that people just won't talk about. And the other thing that's so annoying about this is that, especially with regards to sex differences in personality, let's say that you're firmly on the side of women, just for the sake of argument. Well, do you admit to or deny the existence of sex differences in personality? What's better for women? Well, the radical leftists basically say, oh, well, if you talk about sex differences, then you're part of the oppressive patriarchy and you're attributing to women a different kind of temperament in the attempt to continue the suppression. But I could just as easily say, it's like, well, wait a second. Like, if you want to give the individual the greatest degree of freedom, you say, look, you're different from another person. You're different on the basis of a variety of your characteristics, sex being one of them. That's going to have some effect on what sort of choices you want to make in your life. It's like, go ahead and make whatever choices you want, as far as they're a direct expression of your being. And so if you deny the existence of these sex differences, which no serious commentator in the psychological literature, in the personality domain, and those are the people who know about this thing, nobody debates whether or not sex differences in personality exist, or that they have a biological component. And what's also interesting about that is that none of those people are conservatives. There are no conservative psychological researchers to speak of. They're in a tiny minority. So the people that have done the research indicating that there are differences between the sexes in personality, and that those differences have in part a biological component, those are liberal and left-leaning people who've drawn those conclusions, despite what their ideological presuppositions might have suggested to them to begin with. So, it's, I don't know what to say about that, except that it's all appalling.
I suppose the fear must be that difference will ultimately be used for leverage, for status.
Sure, and that's a reasonable fear. Because anything can be manipulated, but claims of identity claims that people are identical in some way can also be used for the same reason. If I insist that everyone is exactly the same on all dimensions, that there's just as much of a totalitarian threat lurking in there as there is the threat lurking that we'll use differences as an excuse.
Yes.
And we're also not having a serious discussion about this. It's like, yeah, men are overrepresented at the top of the economic apex. That's true. It's a small minority of men, by the way. It's certainly not men in general, but they're radically overrepresented at the bottom. And believe me, man, like, nobody cares about men who are failures. they are like off the bloody radar.
Yeah.
So, and there's no sympathy for men who are failures. So men stack up at the top and the bottom. And we don't have a discussion about that. And we don't have a discussion about the fact that women are radically underrepresented in dangerous jobs, although they are, or in trades that require like brutal physical labor. Women are radically underrepresented, or in jobs outside, women are radically underrepresented. So the complaint is always, well, if you look at the top 1%, there are more men than there should be, by pure sex division. It's like, well, yeah, but if you look at the bottom, the reverse is true. So if we're going to have the discussion, I don't really necessarily think we should have that discussion, but if we're going to have the discussion, then we should look across the entire economic spectrum.
I wonder how much of this debate is being governed by unconscious forces. I wonder how much of what we're experiencing is a manifestation of a sort of where cartography has not yet been. I think that
I think a lot of it. What are you thinking about? Any particular part of it?
What I feel like is that the reason that I imagine that your arguments that are based on research are so successful is because people are expressing feelings as opposed to cogent and researched arguments. It feels like there is a powerful, dominant patriarchy, and no one can deny, that there is power. There's such a thing as power, and there are people that benefit from structures being as they are.
Of course.
That's the point of those structures being the way they are. One of the things I've observed is that whenever change is discussed, and my tendency has always been to be sympathetic towards movements that are about change or empowerment of what might be termed disadvantaged groups, that change is all that when you're curious about the resistance of change or the difficulties that you face when trying to bring about change, look at who would be negatively impacted were that change to be brought about. And usually that means that there's some people for conservatism makes sense to a particular group of people. One of the things I felt when reading a book was that, because I think you're coming from a perspective of psychoanalysis, and it rings the language rings true and the analysis rings true. Where I feel, one question I was keen to bring to you is when you talked about skateboarders in I think it's the last but one chapter, and that spirit of a young people, courage and a willingness to try dangerous things and to push forward. I wonder how that sits with the idea of an earlier passage in the book where you talk about the gratitude that we should feel for, having time to read a book and the ability to read a book, and sort of respect for the establishments and systems that have been set up from which we all benefit. Because when I could find it difficult to dispute your opinion about sort of churlish, what would have been in the lexicon of the day, social justice warriors, and that kind of somewhat rootless, unresearched rage. I identify what you're saying there. People that can't keep their bedrooms tidy, you be careful before you let them organise an economic system. But similarly, where is change going to come from? Who is going to challenge tyranny? Is it going to be?
Those are the sorts of twin forces that we have to contend with across the political spectrum. So I could run through something quickly to put the things that you just brought up in perspective. Let's say, okay. So the first thing is that hierarchies, if you're going to value some things more than others, then hierarchies are inevitable. And you have to value some things more than others, or you don't have anything valuable.
Like beauty or strength or something.
Or competence, or whatever it happens to be. The ability to play the flute, right? It doesn't matter what it is.
High on my list.
Well, obviously, if you value music, then you're going to value some musicians more than others because some are better. So you have to value things in order to move forward in life, and you have to value things in order to have something valuable to produce. But if you play out the value in a social landscape, you're going to produce a hierarchy. And the problem with producing a hierarchy is that a small number of people are going to be more successful than the majority, and a very large number of people aren't going to be successful at all at that particular thing. It's inevitable. So, okay, now, so you say, well, we have to put up with that because we need to pursue things of value. Okay, fine. So that's the right-wing perspective, is that the hierarchies are justifiable and necessary. Now, the left-wing perspective is, yeah, but wait a minute. The problem with hierarchies is that people stack up at the bottom and that they tilt towards tyranny across time. And that's also true. And so you need that dialectic in society between the right wing that says, you know, we need the hierarchies and they're useful and you should be grateful for them, and they structure you and give you form and provide value, and the left that says, yeah, but they exclude people and people stack up at the bottom, and that's dangerous to the hierarchy itself, and it means that people might not have opportunity, and you have to say yes to that. The problem comes, and this is the situation we're in right now, where the radical leftists, and this is mostly a problem that really permeates the universities, the radical leftists say, yeah, but all hierarchies are just tyrannical power. It's like, oh no, they're not. Hierarchies are based on competence in a functioning society, and mostly our society functions. So you can't go that far. Now, that doesn't mean that hierarchies don't tilt towards self-interest and tyranny across time, but that's a bad thing. It's even a bad thing from the conservative perspective.